Welcome to Rising 8 Minis. In this video I'm going to show you the sketching process I go through when I'm painting non-metallic metals. Enjoy! Okay, so we're just going to prep our colours for painting Aries. So we're setting a wet palette up. If you don't know how to set a wet palette up or you haven't used a wet palette, I'd definitely refer you to the video that I've done before on wet palettes. I think it's pretty good. It should explain everything you need to know, and it shows you how to get a little satisfying roll on your parchment paper, which, as we all know, is the best bit of any mini painting project. So just get the wrinkles out, smooth those through, and then we'll get started. So when you're mixing up paints, I would just use an old cheap brush. I think I've had this one about a decade, something like that. And yeah, you don't want to use a nice smart Kolinsky head brush to mix up paints with it. So all you're going to do is just going to get it wet and get that ready, and then you're going to start laying down your shades. Make sure you shake it all before you get going. And then we're going to put some black down. That's our red oxide. That's our warm yellow. Watch out for those bits. Cool yellow. And a white. So we've got all our shades down on the palette. So I'm going to start and take my red oxide. Point is, you want to get quite a lot on there, build up a nice little pool of paint, because you're going to use this as basically the body of your paint for later on. You can come back to it, obviously. You just want to build that up, and you see the consistency. It's very, very liquid, almost watery, but not quite translucent. So if you paint this, you can see there, it's almost translucent if you keep washing and washing and washing. So we're just going to, for our first stage, add a bit of black into that. We don't want to use all the colour, you don't want it to all merge in. So we just want to keep one section because we're only going to use this for the beginning. So keep adding.
Hi, Daddy.
Until you've got the shade that you really want to go for. So with these first stage highlights, I'm using Kimera Kolours. Again, the links will be down in the description. So I've made up a mix of red oxide and black, carbon black. And this is basically just a really dark shade which will go over the top and act as the base for all my various highlights, which I'll build on later. You almost want to cover all of your black areas, but leave little tiny bits which will be your very deepest shadows. So little tiny gaps, and you should be able to see that on the zoom ins. But what you'll do is you'll work through, pick up, and eventually what you'll do is you'll work towards the middle of these shapes, and that will eventually what you build up with your highlights with. Don't make these too small, it'll be too hard to highlight up to later. So, but also you're using this such a dark colour, because if you use too light a colour, it's hard to build up, and you also like get an unrealistic effect. But also, if you get the placement slightly wrong, this is a sketching stage, don't forget, if you get the placement slightly wrong, it's an easier colour to cover up later on. So that makes a bit more sense. It's not as readable later on, as you'll see. So because this is a longer video, I'm just going to try and do some speed up shots and whip through these fairly quickly. You can always, because you're playing it back, you can always have a look and pause it and play it, and I would definitely recommend to do that. Or in fairness, if you really are struggling, you can always drop a message down below in the comments, and I'll try and send you some full footage. I don't mind doing that if that's helpful for you. But all you're really doing at this point is you're just laying down your placements, sketching it out, and you're doing that across all the armour that you're going to be. So we're working on the gold section at the moment, so we're going to everything that's going to be gold. I'm just going to go through the entire model, sketching it out. So you can see at that point I'm constantly flipping the model backwards and forwards, looking at that reference light, making sure I've got everything in the right places. That's a constant process you're going through. Sometimes I'll even put the model down, step away from it, have a quick look, see if I can work out what's going on. There's no hard set process for this, you've just got to work through and get into a natural flow on your own. So it's very much a case of do a little bit, stop, check it, do a little bit, stop, check it, fix it, and move on. So again, I've almost finished the highlights at this point. So I'm just turning the model over in my hand, making sure that I'm looking at it and that it's all making sense and I've not missed anywhere. That's a really annoying step if you have to keep going back to your palette and filling in bits you've missed later on. So it's worthwhile making sure you've got it all down. But if you look at the colour difference now, you can sort of see where you're going with this now. You've got decent contrast, you've got the darker areas in there, and you've got your main areas of highlight. You can almost imagine what it's going to look like later on. This is just before you start getting to the really ugly phase, so this is the bit where you start thinking, might have some progress here. So yeah, have a review of the Mini before you start moving on to the next stage. Right, now you can see I'm working on the opposite side, so what I've done is I've made a mix of phthalo green and black. Same principle as when I mixed up the red oxide and black. You're just laying down sketching stages, and this is the opposite source of light, which will come in later. So again, I'm just going to whiz through this process. It's exactly the same process, just a different colour. One thing that may help when you're laying your opposite sources of light, though, is again using the light trick, using your lamp trick, so shining your lamp where you want your opposite sources of light coming through. But just try and look from the direction of that light, and any raised surfaces you can see, even if it's in the other side of the model, which is currently painted in that red shade, any raised surfaces you can see from there, just try and catch those shadows so you're laying down some sort of shadows, because light only travels in straight lines. If you can see a surface, it would be hit by this opposite light source, so that it will still be blue, have a blue or a blue tone later on. So you're just laying, like I say, the purpose is you're just laying down sketches, and you're just trying to see what works and what doesn't at this point. Okay, on to our next stages. We want to try and make that red oxide a little bit brighter. So I'm just going to take a little bit of our warm yellow and we're going to mix that in. And we don't need to go a long way with this. Just want probably a bit more paint than that, so we're going to go a bit lighter. But I don't want to go too fast too quickly, so I'm just going to introduce a bit more of that red oxide back in. Okay, that probably gives us our next shade. Right, are you ready for some drama? No, I'm just kidding. This is just a slightly brighter shade of the last time. So again, what you're going to do is you're going to pick through, you're going to mix up slightly lighter shade. In this case, I've used red oxide again, so I've gone back to my red oxide shade, and I've added slightly less black to it, so it's a slightly brighter shade. You don't want to jump too quickly, otherwise it becomes difficult to blend, and then you're just going to go over those same areas you did before. The purpose of this is you're just adding a slightly lighter highlight, and what you want to do is you want to cover almost all of the layer you did before. You want to leave a tiny little bit. You don't want to lose your midtones, you don't want to lose your final bases, you don't want to cover almost all of that with your slightly brighter tone. So you're just going to work through that process. I'm going to do little zoom in shots and speed ups just to get through the video in a sort of a timely sort of way. So hopefully this is nice and clear for you. If it isn't, or you're unsure of anything, don't forget to just drop a comment down below, and don't forget, if you're liking and finding this sort of stuff useful, it would be really great if you could subscribe to the channel too. Thanks a lot. So at this point I realised I actually put a little bit too much red oxide into the mix, but I kind of liked it, so I decided to stick with it. It's all part of the process. Sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes they look atrocious, sometimes you quite like them. You just got to go with it and see what happens. It's painting, it's art at the end of the day. It sounds very pretentious, but it's true. So after having a quick look around the miniature, I've now sort of decided that, yeah, I need to do a bit more work, because what I've done is I've come up a bit too quickly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glaze a little bit of my previous shading, so my midtones to my red oxide and black. I'm going to shade a bit of that to add a bit more shadow back into there. You'll see what I mean in a second as we look through it. The purpose of doing this is that it improves the blending, but it'll add more contrast into those deeper shadows and just give you a bit of a better look. At this point the model starts to look really ugly and you start to panic and go, oh god, what have I done? This is horrendous. Stick with it, stick with the process, trust the process, and it'll work out okay. You can see it starts to look a bit sort of zebra striped here, and you're like, oh no, what have I done? It will eventually look a bit better than this. So you can see I'm very quickly laying down colours. I'm just putting those back in. You want to make sure you've got enough pigment in there. I've probably put it on a bit thick here, but this isn't, let's say this is a sketch phase, so it doesn't matter too much. The trick is, whenever you're glazing or adding colour in like that, make sure you're moving towards the area where you want colour. So, for example, you can see my brush, I'm pulling it from the highlight area to the shadow area, because where your brush ends up is where most of your pigment will end up. So you'll end up with a little pool of water. The only way to really get to grips with this is to really try it. So you'll start in the you'll start in where you want your you'll start in the middle of your highlight, sorry about that, and you'll drag it back towards your shadow. And that's basically it. We're just going to work over the entire model doing that wherever it seems appropriate. So you can see me working it through. But like I said, this is the stage where it starts to look a bit, starts to enter its ugly phase, and you've just got to sort of stick with it. Next up, we're going to go brighter again, so we're going to take a little bit more of our warm yellow. If you use the yellow, it keeps the pigment content really high, so you get a much more intense sort of colour. If you start using white at this point, then it starts to desaturate everything, and with that you start moving more and more towards a grey sort of shade, which is not what we want at this point. So we're going to add some warm yellow. Then you want to keep introducing colours from the previous bit, and then you can start to work your way towards it. And that'll probably do, to be honest with you. Nice and easy. So I've continued to add highlights again. So at this point I've added Kimera warm yellow to my red oxide mix, which just continues to bring it up. Adding in yellows instead of whites, although it seems more intuitive to add whites to a mix to make it brighter, it will make it brighter, but what it'll do is it'll desaturate everything as well and just make everything look like almost shift towards more pastel shades. What you want to try and do is keep that intensity in the colour, otherwise you'll lose it very quickly. You only want to use white for those very final stages. So use colours which are similar but brighter. So you want to, like I say, I'm using warm yellow here, and I'm just slowly bringing that up shade by shade by shade towards my high points. Again, you're going through that process where you're covering almost all of your previous layer, but taking care not to cover your midtones, and you're just going back in and putting those over the top. Smaller and smaller brush strokes at this point. So you're just continuing to work through that model. Like I say, you're sort of passing through the ugly phase a little bit now, and so you can sort of see where you're going. So again, at this point, after looking at the mini, you then go back to the previous colour we're using, and you're just going to pick up those shadows and start glazing back into those shadows, just trying to smooth it out a little bit. You can see where I'm working from the shadows, so what I'm doing is I'm working, just filling in a bit of extra shape down there. I'm actually covering up elements at that point on his tabard, and then covering back up, and then you can see what I'm doing with the glazing. Once I'm happy with the bit of direction I've got it in and the sort of surfaces I'm covering, and then moving him back towards the shadows, I'm just bringing that back in again. So again, after a quick look at the model, I decide that I actually probably need to extend some of these highlights out, so I start to work with one of the midtones and just extend those out just a little bit alongside the other bits of the model as well, just to catch into some of those areas which I'd previously done as my opposite light source, because it's not as clear cut as one side's yellow, one side's blue. There's an intermingling of the shades, nothing's ever that clear cut when you're painting and in nature. So you're trying to just get a feel for areas that might catch a little bit of the light and just work through those. So once we're at this point, we can add a little bit more and see what this looks like, but we may have to start moving on from warm yellow. No, that's still okay. I mean, we're almost at a solely warm yellow. So you go to this point, but what we might end up doing as well is just adding a little bit of cool yellow into that mix as well. Just brings it up a touch. So if at any point you think, oh, that's a bit deep, you can always go back to one of your previous pools of colour, which is why it's important to have slightly larger pools of colour, and you can knock it back down slightly again as well. So you can go up and down depending on what you decide to do. You just got to play it by ear a little bit and see how you go. Okay, so we're finally into our final highlight stages now. You can see at this point I've actually mixed in, because we're moving towards a whiter shade now, so I've actually brought the colour temperature of the yellow down. I'll have another video about colour temperature and how to use colour and all these things coming up in the future, but I just wanted to lay down some of these technical videos first and just see what people thought of them. If you have disagree with that, or you want to see some more colour theory and the more basic stuff first, then yeah, just drop it down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this process as well, just remember to drop us a subscription as well, or a like drop a like the video, and then yeah. So we're moving towards the final highlights now. So we're going to add a large dollop of cool yellow. And I say that will pretty much be our final tones lay on top, with the exception of a really fine small one. So we're talking millimeters of space on the model. And for that, we're going to add in a touch of white. Now you'll see what I mean by the desaturation at this point, which is why you've got to be really careful how you use this. If you use too much of it, it just makes the whole model look sort of milky, and you lose your effect. So you only want to use it to the very final highlights. And then maybe for your last little bits of touching up, or maybe edge highlighting, you might add an almost pure white with a touch of that yellow in there. And that's it. Okay, so we're going one highlight higher now. A little bit more yellow into the mix, and then just using that to bring this up nice and steadily. So again, working into this higher section now, you can see the sort of the size of the area working on, maybe 3 or 4 millimeters across, so really small areas. So make sure you've got a nice sharp tip on the brush, and you're just working your way through, highlighting. This is when the model really starts to come together, so you can start to look and go, yes, nailed it, or oh goodness me, what have I done? Either way, it's not unfixable, it's just paint on, so if you've done it wrong, just take it back to your next step, colour it over again, and start again. Nice and easy. There's no pressure with this stuff. If you get it wrong, you can always repaint it completely black and then completely restart the area again. I've worked into the back area a little bit as well. As we speed through, you'll see that, and I've literally I've kept the back area slightly darker shades, so it's slightly orangey. My thinking behind that is there wouldn't be quite as much intense light on the front as on the back of the model as there would be on the front of the model, so you want it to be slightly darker. We'll see if that pans out later on in the project, but for now I'm pretty pleased with it. Yeah, I hope you are too. So you can see at this point you've got a nice gradient for the colours. So if you were to just smooth those together, you get a nice smooth gradient along the side. And that's what you want. You want so that you can, as you blend your model, you'll end up with more of that sort of level of transition rather than that sort of level of transition. By the end of this video, we'll have more of this sort of effect, which is just layers on layers on layers on layers on layers. But by glazing, we'll then blur everything together and then end up with a nice smooth transition. Here are the very final highlights. I've actually started to add a tiny little bit of white in, not too much for the desaturation point of view that I talked about earlier, but I've added a tiny little bit of white in, and I'm just very quickly dipping those in. You can see I'm using the flat side of my brush there to start the beginnings of the edge highlighting, which I'll do in the armour later. This just helps to pick out the details, help the model read slightly differently. On any hard surface like this on a metal, you'd always get a high shine area. You'd also have a secondary shadow too. But we'll do that. We'll start working on that process a little bit later on. Let's try and explain that process probably on the next video now, because we're already however long we are into this project. So just working through those final highlight points, maybe covering an area 1 or 2 millimeters in size, and just literally just dipping and dabbing in. And we're not going to do the very final highlights here, because there's a whole process to do on glazing and working back into the shadows and lifting things and smoothing things out. So this is the end of our sketch phase. But I'm really pleased with this model. It looks pretty cool. This is our final model. I'm pretty pleased with the result. I'm just going to quickly turn it around. This is all our gold stages. You can see I've kept this area off to one side. There'll be a future video coming up about the cloak and how I did the cloak. And equally there'll be a future video coming up about the OSL and how I managed to do that too. So as you can turn it around, you can see the colour contrast between the two. And this is all based on that phthalo green step I showed you earlier on. So you can see that very quickly building up. So in future videos, we've got the cloak, we have the opposite light source, and then we'll have all the glazing stages to really smooth this chap out and add in details and bits before we eventually end up at a finished model. If you've stuck with me this far, I can only assume you actually liked the video, so make sure you give us a like and a subscribe. And stay tuned for the next one, because we've got loads of exciting stuff coming up. We've got the finishing of the Ares series coming up, so we've got his cloak and we've got his OSL and his glazing process. But we've also got other interesting series like colour theory and inspirational artists and product reviews. So stay tuned for all of that. If you want to see anything specific in the comments, as always, just let me know. See you next time.